All right, Social 30-1 students, we're going to do the second half of this lesson on Chapter 12, the so-called viability of liberalism. In the last lecture, we looked at this slide, and I had covered some aspects that could challenge or move liberalism in another direction post modern liberalism, as outlined in Chapter 8. We looked at all of these points. Then in chapter 12, I introduced some ideologies and movements that not only could challenge liberalism, but perhaps destroy it, turn it into anarchy, turn it into chaos, turn it into dictatorship, etc. Okay, and we covered the first of those points, which was postmodernism. We will cover the other points to a lesser degree today, focusing mostly on the first two, extremism and corporate welfare. Silent discussion. Okay. That's not hard for you guys. I taught you this semester, and for most of the times we tried discussion, it was rather silent. But think to yourselves, why might some people adopt positions and actions that are so far from what is considered acceptable by most people? How does this challenge liberalism? You might want to pause and think about that for a minute. All right, so the second ideology movement that could challenge and destroy liberalism would actually be extremism. And as you can see on the top there, it says a belief system that is outside of the mainstream spectrum of beliefs, and it supports actions considered morally or socially unacceptable. So the example you see there on the left is the environmental movement spiking trees to prevent trees from being cut down. Okay. Would you consider a person, for example, who spikes trees to be an extremist? Well, most of us today would say yes. What the hell are they doing? Would a tree spiker call themselves extremists? Well, if they were somewhat introspective, they might, and then they just wouldn't care. Or maybe they would think that the law needs to be changed. So, yes, they're extreme now, but at some point there might be enough reform where they're no longer extreme. Though I don't see anyone that puts spikes in trees, even in the future, would still not be considered extreme. Extremism is completely dependent on perspective, not unlike the postmodernists that we talked about the other day. Social norms and time period. Using the term extreme is usually a label given to others. You usually don't, call yourself disgusting or gross or bad or whatever. Other people usually label those things on you. Some extremist view become adopted over time by the general public. Can you think of examples? Well, certainly, environmentalism would be an example of that. It was extreme a generation or two ago, not so extreme now. The concept of composting and recycling, that was kind of hippy dippy. Now it's not so hippy dippy, it's kind of more mainstream. Universal suffrage was extreme. Okay, what are these people wanting to vote for? Why would women want to vote? Okay, fashion, the idea of germs. Okay, uh, Darwinism. Continuing on, some extremists may identify themselves, however, as extreme. They know they're extreme. Okay, they know they're outside the boundaries of norms, and they don't care, and they want to actually move that boundary or so what is acceptable towards them more. Al Qaeda would be an example. I'm just reading from the slide here. They claim that they are extreme and must use these measures, such as violence, to meet their cause. And violence doesn't justify what they do. They believe there is injustice in the world powers. The so called economic, military, and political power is concentrated in the hands of a small group. The West, the Europeans, okay, they're the have nots. They're sick and tired of being oppressed, of being used, being exploited. They claim the West is working to use their powers to hold others, like those in the Middle East, powerless. You can see political cartoons on the bottom, etc. So, how extreme is too extreme? I mean, extreme or extremism has its various levels. Okay, you know the the Greenpeace people are one form of extreme. That's an environmental extreme. Then you have Al Qaeda, which is certainly a much more different extreme. Okay, but even within that, there are fractions of extreme. ISIS broke away from Al Qaeda a number of years ago because they couldn't understand or agree with the level of extremity that both were capable of. ISIS wanted to actually be more extreme. And so they actually broke away from Al Qaeda a number of years ago. Like I said, ISIS seeks to establish an Islamic state within Iraq and Syria. They're conquering cities in the newly established democratic state of Iran. Now, just to give you a bit of an update on this, since President Trump took over a few years ago, uh, ISIS's control over that area has diminished to a great extent. There has been a um, concentrated effort by the U.S. military to rid that region of ISIS. And like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail with what ISIS did, but that some of their punishments on their so-called enemies was um, medieval in fashion. Okay, just either torturous or they just thought up of new and very inventive ways of executing people. Okay, and it was all to bring about shock. It was all to bring about fear. Okay, so it wasn't just to shoot somebody, it was to decapitate or to drown them alive or burn them alive or throw them off buildings or some other kind of spectacle type of way to doing it in which would invoke fear on people so they would cower and obey them. All right, another issue with extremism. How can extremism challenge? Well, I think there's a fairly simple question and answer. Liberalism is about choice, it's about freedom, it's about respect. Whereas extremism is, we're going to take away those things. One of the major challenges presented to liberalism when faced with extremism is that governments may restrict your freedoms or your liberties for all in order to rectify the extremist movement. I mean, since September 11th, 2001, the freedoms in the United States and Canada have been fairly restricted compared to the way they used to be, as far as travel, as far as you know, you know, checking up on what people are up to, coordination, etc. So, going back in history, October crisis of 1970, the FLQ, uh, our own government invoked the War Measures Act, which for a temporary period of time restricted our freedoms. Like I said, post 9/11, the US passed the Patriot Act. Okay. And, they really haven't cut back too much on some of those provisions outlined in the Patriot Act. Okay. So the freedoms that we had enjoyed prior to September 11th have now been taken away for the sake of security. All right, and you can see some of the examples here. They can search terrace homes, businesses, other properties without consent, occupants' knowledge. Okay, so for example, this would go against the so called Fourth Amendment, which says that law enforcement doesn't have the right to arbitrarily search and seize your items without due cause. The FBI, it's been in the news a lot the last few years. They are doing things without your knowledge. Edward Snowden kind of blew the lid off of the amount of surveillance that the United States government through the NSA and the CIA, FBI do without the knowledge of our citizens. I mean, they can go through your mail, they can go through your phone records, they can go through your internet records, they can, for a lot of people, they can especially if you have some sort of ties with people outside the country. You can be surveyed for all your occupancy, all your not occupancy, sorry, your activities, etc. All right. Yes, there's strong opposition, but there would be those would argue that you need that sense of security and that kind of surveillance to achieve security. And if you don't have that, then what could be our next 9/11, so to speak. All right, so there's just a few notes here. It just goes into a little case study about what happened in Egypt back in 2011. Just a couple more slides about extremism. I'm not going to go into two more. Feel free to go into the slide itself and watch some of these videos. They're rather hilarious, especially the Bill Maher clip where you see not Matt Damon, but Ben Affleck just his face just becomes beet red as he becomes angry and angry and angry in the clip. All right, so once again, understand that concept of extremism. I'm not going through this slide so much. Extremism ultimately challenges liberal beliefs about the structure of society. They're basically saying, what you're doing doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work for us. It challenges our interpretation of history, okay, and even our vision of the future. Their thinking is that we got to the way we were because of a certain exploitation, not because of some sort of manifest destiny. Okay, and our vision for the future, your vision might be some sort of progress, technological advancement, blah 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 blah. Their vision might be some sort of reaction. Let's go back to the way things used to be, or let's create some sort of new normal. And you think of history, the Jacobins during the French Revolution were extremists. The Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, especially the Bolsheviks prior to the Russian Revolution, were extremists. Okay. Extremism ultimately challenges liberalism's tolerance. And that is one of the weaknesses of liberalism because liberalism believes in tolerance and acceptance and allowance for different viewpoints. But when you allow for an extremist to have a platform, it can grow and fester and become stronger over time. And it becomes a point where you can no longer control them, and once they take over, voila, no more liberalism. All right. So, for example, freedom of expression is challenged when extremists profess intolerant views of other people. I mean, how much is too much? And once again, that kind of goes against our liberal principles of freedom of expression. But, if that extremist view gains too much control or power, then it's the proverbial Pandora's box. Can you put that back in the box, so to speak? All right, another type of extremism is economic extremism. Okay, and that could be collectivism, socialism in its vein, maybe corporatism that was done under the fascists, and also in a way done in our country. Extremism also used by some people to characterize economic activities that strictly adhere to a set of principles despite perceived adverse effects on a population. For example, because I like using specific examples, it backs up my points. During the Cold War, the economic practices of communist countries were seen as extremist by the United States and other free market countries. Milton Friedman would absolutely hate what the communists did. It stifled innovation, it stifled motivation. Critics of the free market principles have also claimed that some forms of capitalism have become extremist. Um, I believe in a previous lesson I talked about neoliberalism as an example of that, because neoliberalism just creates a wider gap between the wealthy and the poor. This lady, Naomi Klein, I don't know if you were in my 10-1 class, but I showed a video back in the day called No Logo. and she would be in a spectrum to the left. She's a left wing. I wouldn't call her, a radical or anything like that, but certainly, quite left on the political and economic spectrum. So this is her quoting from one of her books. It says Friedman, she's referring to Milton Friedman, dreamed of depatterning societies or returning them to a state of pure capitalism, cleansed of all interruptions, government regulations, trade barriers, and entrenched interest. His rule book made some people extremely prosperous, winning for them something approximating complete freedom, to ignore borders, to avoid regulation and taxation, and to amass new wealth. Okay, so she's basically saying that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and once you have wealth, you can start consolidating that. All right, so she's against capitalism for the sake that it doesn't protect weaker individuals or the people that have less ability to take care of themselves. What I see personally, the problem, you know, not so much what Naomi Klein talked about, and feel free to watch her videos. They're very well made from her perspective. But the problem comes from the marriage of government and business. And that marriage is called corporate welfare. Now, under the fascists, they had, corporatism or the corporatist state in which certain businesses had contracts with governments in order to build and promote and all that for their country. And those businesses would benefit and others would not. Workers would not benefit, etc. Corporate welfare is somewhat similar to that. I will read the definition for you right here. It's a term that analogizes corporate subsidies to welfare payments for the poor. The term is often used to describe a government's bestowal, that means giving, of money grants, that's money, tax breaks, and other special favorable treatment on corporations or selected corporations, and that's a keyword, selected, and implies that corporations are much less needy of such treatment than the poor. The term is used interchangeably with crony capitalism. To the extent that there is a difference, the corporate welfare might be restricted only to direct government subsidies of major corporations, excluding tax loopholes and all manner of regulatory and trade decisions in which practice could be much larger than any direct subsidies. The term corporate welfare was reportedly invented in 1956 by Ralph Nader. Conservatives like Grover Norquist prefer crony capitalism. All right, maybe I need to describe what it is. It's just pretty much, in a nutshell, where certain businesses get nice contracts with governments. They're going to get paid. They're going to get preferential treatment. They're going to get, decent or really good tax breaks or just tax havens in order to produce a product that will help that country grow stronger. In exchange, it limits competition with other rival companies. They don't prosper as much. And so it becomes this kind of, I call it neo mercantilism that is created. Neo as in new, mercantilism is the economic state that occurred in the Western countries prior to, capitalism. Okay, so in many ways, it creates a widening gap of the wealthy versus the poor. And you look at some of these terms, it's one of the things that really, what you see in our country isn't so much capitalism, okay, but you see a lot of examples of corporate welfare or crony capitalism where it's not pure competition, where the best product or the best item wins out. It's usually the best, uh, you know, ability for a company to make an arrangement with so-called government officials. Let's pass a law. Let's create a situation where our company will benefit. Okay, maybe we'll give money to their campaign, uh, or donate to their campaign, etc. So that's what crony capitalism is. And so feel free to watch the videos that I have about crony capitalism. All right, another idea that I don't know if it necessarily could destroy liberalism, but it's one where it's been very controversial for a number of years, and that is affirmative action. Okay. Some would argue, has modern liberalism and this idea of progressivism, where we're trying to bring about equality of not only opportunity, but perhaps quality of outcome for all, has it gone too far? This theme refers to policies that take factors including race, color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or national origin into consideration in order to benefit a so called underrepresented group in areas of employment, so getting a job, going to school, university, and business, usually justified as countering the effects of a history or discrimination. Affirmative action is intended to promote equal opportunity. Okay, some would argue not opportunity, but equal outcome. It is often instituted in government and educational settings to ensure that minority groups within a society are included in all programs. The justification for affirmative action is that it helps to compensate for past discrimination, persecution, or exploitation by the ruling class of a culture or those minorities that are seen as more economically challenged. In other words, what it just means is that certain groups, cultural, ethnic groups, because of their placement in said country, have had advantages, and those advantages over the generations have perpetuated themselves. Whereas if you are from a disadvantaged group, that those disadvantages have perpetuated themselves as far as social standing, job opportunities, educational, etc. And so this action is trying to offset that. Okay, it's trying to correct that to a certain extent. So they would believe in things like quotas. Okay, they would believe in things like, okay, we have to categorize people based on certain criteria, etc. Very controversial. If you're a classical liberal, for example, you would believe in the idea of individualism. What I did in 2020 shouldn't have any standing of what happened in 1950. Okay, I have not been the cause of any of that. Whereas someone else would argue that everything that you are today is the culmination of the actions of your ancestors. Okay, and certainly you can debate that back and forth and all that, and it's a fairly fascinating issue. But that's what affirmative action is. Something that's prevalently done in the United States and Canada as far as uh, policies. Here's a kind of a silly political cartoon that kind of pokes fun at the whole issue of affirmative action. And they're basically saying, well, it doesn't poke fun, sorry, it doesn't poke fun at affirmative action. It just pokes fun at the arguments against it. You can see admissions, you get the daughter of alum. Okay, that's cronyism. Okay, the son of a big donor, once again, cronyism. Soccer, athletics, raised in a distant state, but let's just blame the minority why this person to the right didn't get in. All right, another issue or ideology that could ultimately destroy liberalism could be consumerism. Okay. Once again, number one, consumerism is the protection or promotion of the interest of consumers, people that are using things, claims that there is economic growth through the distribution of money. So, how is it a threat? It threatens it. According to the textbook, most of the money we spend goes towards products that don't promote progression. Okay. Spending can lead to debt, and when you are in debt, you're basically stuck. Well, this is, student submitted work. I probably would not say stuck in a rut. It's not official enough. But if you're spending money into areas where you don't need to, it's like throwing money away. I have this GIF, I don't know how you pronounce it, of me throwing money away. Maybe I'll post that a little bit later. But anyways, consumerism could ultimately, if we're spending too much, we're going into debt. We are actually much less free. All right. You can see on this graph, it is a social and economic order that encourages the purchase of goods and services in ever greater amounts. Beginning in the 1990s, the most frequent reason given for attending college has changed to making a lot of money, outranking reasons such as becoming an authority in a field or helping others in difficult. Well, when I look at my own personal background, why did I go to university? Probably at the time was, that's what all my friends were doing. Okay. And certainly the number one reason why I went to university probably at the time was not making money because last I checked, history professors, and then ultimately I am a social studies teacher. Uh, anyways, back in grade nine, if you're in my grade nine class, I showed this video. Feel free to click on the link. Okay. I will give you a preemptive apology if you do so. All right. Poverty could be another way in which um, liberalism could be destroyed. Okay. And like I said, I'm not going to read all of this, but, when people are poor, uh, they want to change and they're desperate. I mean, if you have a choice between taking security and the loss of freedom or death, I would say most people would choose the whole security and loss of freedom. Here's a political cartoon, kind of poking fun at the irony. Um, you know, this guy is complaining about the Beijing Olympics in 2008 because China is known for being a very undemocratic dictatorial regime. But at the same time, this guy enjoys the so called fruits of the Chinese economic system. Basically, everything he owns was ultimately produced itself in China. Like I said, poverty can destroy liberalism because people will ultimately choose security over freedom. Once again, this is a political cartoon kind of poking fun at the differences between, certain people's salaries and really poor people throughout the world. Occupy Wall Street was an event that occurred a number of years ago where people were rising up and saying, enough's enough. There's just too much disparity between the wealthy, the so called 1%, and basically everyone else, the so called 99%. They were saying that, we pay too much attention on the stock markets. We focus too much on outsourcing and maximizing profits and getting money for the shareholders. And we're not thinking about the lives of millions of people that are becoming less and less and less as maybe they were a generation ago. And that was that movement called Occupy Wall Street. Another issue that could curtail democracy is censorship found on the internet. Just today, President Trump is going to pass a so called executive order. And I'll talk about executive orders a little bit more in chapter 10 that will try to curtail what's going on with Twitter and Facebook. Left wing people would argue that he's cutting in and he shouldn't take part in a private business, whereas the right wing people are saying that someone needs to step in and make this communication center more fair. But certainly, any kind of censorship on the internet would curtail people's freedoms because ultimately, who controls what information is being processed or let out? Okay, who gets to make that decision? What might be their background? What might be their bias, etc. The internet presents new challenges to the liberal values of expression, self interest, freedom of extrusive intrusion from the government. It is practical to uphold these values in today's society, or is it practical when responding to the issues related to the internet? Things to consider: anonymity, executions. I don't want to get into this, but at some point, people that complete believe in libertarianism would say, let that all out there. Okay. We should have access to any kind of information, any kind of image, any kind of whatever. But most people believe that there has to be certain limits to our freedoms. Okay, it is an ethical or perhaps a moral issue. Okay, and some of those issues are described right there. Consider former Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker's words long before the internet was developed. Diefenbaker actually died, I believe, in the late 70s. Freedom includes the right to say what others may object to and resent. The essence of citizenship is to be tolerant of strong and provocative words. And freedom is the right to be wrong, not the right to do wrong. I think he's kind of paraphrasing Voltaire. All right, another issue that could alter, destroy liberalism ultimately could be climate change, natural disasters, the changing of global or regional climate patterns due to large change in atmospheric carbon dioxide. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay, why is it a threat to liberalism? Ultimately, when you have climatic destruction, okay, it takes away your freedom. You want security. Okay, decisions need to be made very quickly. You can't just sit around and blither and dather and debate and all that. Things have to happen immediately. And so your freedoms ultimately can be taken away. Okay, the TV show The Walking Dead, for example, when a bunch of zombies come in and take on, I guess this ties into pandemics. Okay, you don't have time for democracy. You have to have strong, secure leadership. Okay, people need decisions made not today, but yesterday. Water shortages, energy depletion kind of falls into the same category. Ultimately, your life is more important than your freedom. Okay, security. Okay, you need to be able to drink water. Need to be able to have access to security, to shelter. Okay, etc. So those things come first. Okay, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, those things come at the most basic level. Here's a political cartoon about the geopolitics of water. Even though we have some of the best and safest tap water in the world, Americans still buy upward of 28 billion bottles of water a year. Manufacturing this uses as much as 45 to 50 million barrels of oil and produces 3 tons of CO2 a year. 80% of the used bottles wind up in landfills, not in recycling. Plastic bottles heated in the sun can leach chemicals into the water. And on a per ounce basis, bottled water costs twice or more what gasoline does and can be up to 1,000 times the cost of tap water. But isn't it worth it since they no doubt bottle it from some pristine, mysterious source? This political cartoon is dripping, excuse the pun, with sarcasm. Once again, pandemics, we're living through one right now. You can see how our freedom is being curtailed for the sake of security, the so called social distancing, businesses being shut down. It's all about trying to bring about security, okay, trying to keep the spread slower and more even, or perhaps just curtailing it to a great extent. But that's another thing that could get rid of liberalism. And who's to say once you lose these liberal values and laws and all that, that you get it back? Anyway, so that's a pandemic. This might be a question on the last unit exam I give you. Okay. This actually might be not so much the question, might be just the graphic. Okay. Well, like I said, I could certainly add, COVID-19 to the list of pandemics to this graphic. Okay. And I probably will once this little lecture is over. All right, the last point is the emergence of other so called superpowers. If there becomes a point in time where, Western thinking, Western values, Western liberal uh, ideologies become usurped or taken over from challengers, then certainly liberalism could not only be challenged but destroyed. So, what happens in the next generation if China becomes the most dominant geopolitical force in our world? And of course, politically, they follow a more dictatorial means of ruling their people. That certainly could jeopardize our own freedom, because if they become more powerful and we want to work with them, that aid might be tied with certain contingencies. Don't be negative towards China, be positive, etc. All right. So, like I said, not only China, but also India. Like I said, how it's a threat. This event's main threat is the country's success in welcoming more capitalist ideologies and open markets uh, than would typically be embraced by a liberal perspective. But I liked my explanation a little bit better. My explanation was just basically their way of thinking, their way of doing things at some point might overtake our Western liberal way of doing things. All right, that's it for our lesson, part B of the areas in which the viability of liberalism can be destroyed. Next week, I'll get into the chapter 10 lessons. I'll probably break that up into two, and then the chapter 11 lessons. And then we're kind of running out for the year. All right. So take care, kiddos, and see you today at grad.